Hi there, I'm Rick Partlow. Welcome back to How to Write Science Fiction That Doesn't Suck. Today I'm answering a request by a reader, or viewer, who asked me to address a couple of things I've addressed before more broadly in videos about other topics, but he wants to specifically get into exposition and description. And also description, particularly when you're writing battles or action or combat. And the second one interests me more than the first, but I'm going to go into the first so I can get it out of the way and get to the one that I really want to talk about. Exposition. I dealt with this before. Exposition is necessary in most science fiction because you're describing worlds that don't exist. You have to bring the reader into this world and get them comfortable in it before you upend everything. You have to let them know what the usual is before you start with the unusual. And a lot of new writers make what I consider to be a huge mistake and just dump the exposition on the reader at the very beginning of the novel in a big info dump. Like, Dan walked out into the city of Los Angeles. It had been built after the war with the idea in mind of urban planning and maximizing efficiency of, they start going on and on about how the city was built, what it looks like. Now, you're going to have to say what it looks like eventually, but exposition is better served in small doses and casually as the story requires it. Now, there may be a story you're writing that doesn't require you to say anything about the city except that it's huge. Or you might need to say the rich people live, on the upper floors and the poor people live in the lower floors. Something like that. That's maybe all you have to say for your story. Maybe it's not important what the buildings look like, or how it's powered, or how food gets to whoever. But if it is, then you introduce that through character interactions, through conversations, and not conversations that are as you know, Bob conversations, where somebody is explaining something to someone who already knows it. Like, as you know, Bob, this city was founded in 2146 after the nuclear war. No, you don't talk to people that way. Say something like if somebody's cynical, like, man, I feel like maybe they should have just left this place a ruin after it got burned down. I don't think it looks any better now than it did 100 years ago. Or, if the government ever stopped giving the poor people soy paste and algae powder, the city would fall apart if the city ever stopped providing free virtual reality games, the peasants would revolt. Something just like commentary like some guy would make when he's talking to a friend. Like, man, this place sucks. If they ever stopped giving the poor handouts, they would revolt. You don't need to have him go into a history lesson. You don't need to have two guys who already know the history of the place talk about it as if they're giving a lecture in a class. You talk about it like regular people talk about it, and you let little details slip into the conversation. And sometimes you add things offhandedly that will add an air of mystery and other to the place you're in. Like, Heinlein had a famous one where he said in one story, just offhand without explanation, the door dilated, which means that the doors in this place, rather than going sideways, like in Star Trek, or opening outward or inward, like for us, most of us, it opens like a camera lens. It closes and opens like a camera lens. And that's that's just a cool little detail about the way that your society works that you don't have to explain. You don't have to, go into why the doors work that way. They just do. And you can introduce that in just normal, casual speaking without having to fall into the trap of, like a university lecture or a military briefing. Although sometimes a military briefing, if you're writing military science fiction, is a good way to introduce little details, like not about your own society, because everybody would know that, but like maybe about the enemy. Say something like, the enemy conquered this system in 2148, taking advantage of our, being distracted by civil war. But really, it's better to introduce things slowly, gradually, in natural conversation, or as the character experiences them. Like if he's been like working all day, or if it's somebody who's an action hero who got into a fight, he walks into the what you would call the shower, but it's not a shower, it's something else, and you add this little touch, like you don't have to explain it, just like he walked into I call them fresher, and after a quick rinse of soap and water, and the air jets blew him dry, and he walked out, 2 minutes later, something like that. Just some little details you can add about your society that aren't you explaining them to anybody. They're just happening to your main character. Okay, so that's exposition, and that's for the society around you. Exposition about technology, particularly weapons, is a little trickier. Military science fiction is going to require an explanation of the weapons you're using, because the people who are reading military science fiction are interested in the combat, they're interested in the weapons, they're interested in the technology of it and the practical use of it. So if you have a ship that uses like some kind of gravity launched kinetic energy weapon, then you're going to have to explain at certain points what its limitations are. Because, if you're using like gravity, say, that's an incredibly sophisticated, incredibly powerful technology to be throwing around without you explaining the limitations and what this weapon can and can't do. Because theoretically, if the reader knows anything about science, they could realize if you can control gravity, you could create a black hole in the middle of a planet and just destroy planets or stars. So you have to explain the limitations. You have to tell them why you can't do that, why the battle is still necessary. Now, you don't have to have an info dump about that. Again, you could have a couple of characters who are about to start the battle saying like, man, it'd be nice if they figure out a way to make this stuff work better so we could use gravity to destroy their ship from, a light year away and not have to get into this battle. And then the other guys say, yeah, well, they could do the same to us. Something like that. You just mention the limitations. Or if you want, during the actual, if it's a third person particularly, during the actual battle, you could just say something like, the weapons officer's nerves were bothering him as he got closer, knowing that the closer they got to weapons range, the more likely it is that they were going to take a hit first. And he longed for a day when they could make strikes like this at a light year away. And then the more reasonable part of him, figured out that if they could strike the other guy a light year away, they could get struck a light year away too. So maybe it was a good thing that were limitations, something like that. Something that's not like a technical readout, just mentioning that there's limitations and that they dictate the way that the story and the battle unfolds. Okay. Let me explain to you at times when you don't need to do technical data dumps. Anytime it's not necessary it's not crucial to the plot, don't do it. I know people write science fiction, and particularly military science fiction, love to do technical data dumps. But there shouldn't be anything in your book that's not necessary to the plot or the character development. And if your character doesn't need to think about how his gun works, and if it's not crucial to the plot how the gun works, then you don't have to go into any detail about how the gun works. You can just say it's a Gauss rifle. You don't have to go into whether it's a rail gun or a coil gun or if it uses gravity. Just say it shoots projectiles, If it's necessary, like later in the book, for the gun to not work, and you have to describe why it broke or why they're out of juice or whatever, then maybe then you talk about, or earlier, if you want to foreshadow it, talk about why it might break or what the weaknesses are. But if you're not going to use the weaknesses, if you're not going to have the gun break at a crucial moment, then you don't need to describe them. They're not necessary to the plot. You don't have to have somebody have a conversation about, oh, these things are great, except when it gets to be, negative 35 outside, they don't work anymore. And if you're not going to have a scene later in the book where it's negative 35 and their guns stop working, you don't need to tell anybody that. That's not necessary to the plot. You can have all these details. You can have volumes of technical details, but you don't have to introduce them in your book. You don't have to talk about them. You know them. And maybe if the plot changes and there comes a time later where, oh yeah, they're going someplace cold, this is important, then you introduce those technical details, and maybe you want to go back and introduce them in an earlier scene. But don't introduce them because they're cool and you took a while to think of them. That's not how it works. The reader doesn't need to know this. It's not important to the plot. And if you introduce this in the book, if you say at some point earlier in the book, oh, these guns are great, but they stop working at cold temperatures, and then you don't use that later in the book, the reader's going to feel cheated. They're going to say, hold on a second, this was foreshadowing, and then you didn't do anything with it. So bear that in mind. Okay, now I want to get to the more fun part of this, and that is how to describe combat or action. Now this is a difficult thing. Describing the first fight or the first battle in a book is not that difficult, or in a series. Describing the third and the fourth and the fifth and the 10th, then it gets difficult, because you've probably used the same kind of description for one battle after another, and making it sound new, keeping the reader's interest, is going to get hard, particularly space battles. Space battles are really, really hard to make sound interesting. There's several ways to handle space battles, not making them sound interesting, but several ways to handle space battles in military science fiction. And they go from the realistic, and when I say realistic, I mean with current technology, to the almost space fantasy, like Star Wars. You can do the almost space fantasy, with the fighters that bank and, roll and do all kinds of unnecessary crap. And you can make that sound like it has a technological reason for it. I used to do this for fun when I was a kid, because I loved Star Wars, but I also liked in Battlestar Galactica. But I also was into science and, the space race and the actual spaceships. So I'm like, and rather than say, oh, Star Wars is inaccurate, I'm going to poo-poo it and just call it space fantasy, I was like, how could I make something like this happen and have a scientific reason for it? Like maybe there's some kind of theory of the ether that space-time has a charge to it, or something that you can interact with, and these fighters maneuver by interacting with the fabric of space-time, like an airplane would with atmosphere. Or maybe since they're dual environment, they operate in air and in space, maybe they have like maneuvering thrusters that mimic the motions they would do in the air, because that's how they learn to fly. I try to think of excuses for them, and that was a lot of fun, but that's probably a little too esoteric for you to do in your book. But if you do realistic space battles, particularly, they're going to be long and drawn out, and you'll be able to see each other for thousands of kilometers away, maybe 10,000 kilometers away, and you'll be able to fire weapons at each other from 10,000 kilometers away, and it's going to be like, oh, he fired a missile. It'll be here in an hour. Should we maneuver or should we try to intercept it? We'll decide in half an hour. And that only works if other things happen in between this. The way I like to do it when I write realistic-ish space battles is have a lot of things happening at once. So one ship fires a missile, and then the other ships have already fired theirs, so you have to deal with their missiles, and then at the same time you have like some kind of malfunction that has some sort of thing that needs to be serviced, and if it doesn't get serviced within 10 minutes, the missiles are going to hit. And going back and forth between one thing and another with different characters is the way that I tend to try to make realistic space battles sound interesting. That's not going to work as well if you're going from a first-person POV, but if you have multiple POVs, third person, that can work. You go from like the engineer trying to fix the problem to the helmsman who's trying to avoid the missiles, and maybe there's hypersonic railgun rounds coming at him, and you have to keep maneuvering to make sure that you're not in a predictable pattern. And you do a lot of time skipping, like a few minutes later type of deal. I mean, you don't say that, but you like go to engineering, and when you go back to the bridge, it's a few minutes later, and the missile's closer, and they're trying different things. That's what you have to do. If you have a battle going on the ground at the same time, it's even better, because then you can skip between the space battle and the ground battle, and it can really ratchet up the tension when you're going between, like, if you got the battle on the ground, you might have two different POVs there, and then you got the engineer, and you got the helmsman, you got the captain. You could have like space fighters or smaller craft fighting somewhere else, and you can intersperse all this. And maybe if there's the space fighter over here, it can see what's happening with the cruisers, and you can get an exterior view of what's going on. So that is mostly how I handle action in a realistic sense. There are other ways you can handle space battles that are less realistic but still have verisimilitude. And a lot of this deals with how much thought you put into how your faster-than-light drive works. And what I mean by that is, say you have a faster-than-light drive that's a version of the Alcubierre space-time inflation drive, which works by expanding the space behind the starship and contracting it in front of it. People don't think about that. They just use that, and then they have their ships like fighting like Star Trek ships. But if you can manipulate the fabric of space-time, then you could fold space-time around you, which should make a heck of a defensive shield. If somebody shoots a missile at you, or a coil gun, or a laser, you bend the space-time around you, and that means that thing goes away. It goes somewhere else. And you may be forced to deal with the fact that doing that kicks you off in a direction you didn't mean to go. And that might be like a complication of the story. Also, if you can bend space-time, maybe you can bend the space-time around the enemy ship. Maybe you can crush the ship in like with tidal forces from gravity. Maybe you can make that enemy ship go off in a different direction. Maybe that's how battles are fought. You use your fields to like strike at each other, and that can cause like a totally different type of battle to take place, and you can make things interesting by dealing with that. Because if you have two ships that have to be fairly close together to strike at each other, and when they do, the actual fields intersecting could vibrate your ship, try to shake it apart. It could cause a lot of different very cool effects that you can get into and describe the battle in a way that's interesting to the audience. Like, if the ship feels like it's shaking apart, then that's a very dramatic scene that you can use to keep the the readers. I keep saying audience, the reader's interest. Or say you have some kind of a hyperspace style faster than light drive that lets you jump. If you decide that it can let you jump shorter distances, then you have a really exciting battle, because you have smaller ships, and you have like a ship going at like 5G's acceleration, which means if you have 5G's acceleration for any length of time, the only way to slow down is to turn around and do 5G's acceleration the other way for the same length of time. And if somebody's coming at you, or a missile's coming at you, you're screwed. But if you're going at 5G's and that missile starts coming at you and you jump, and that missile's just stranded there, that could be like a tactic, and it has to have some limitations. Maybe you can't jump very close to a planet. Maybe you can only jump so many times in a row before your ship starts to fall apart or you lose power. But that's a way of making combat more interesting. You jump close to the enemy ship and let loose a barrage, and then you jump away, and he tries to do the same to you. That could be a very interesting, very tension ratcheting type of combat. So my advice is, when you're writing military science fiction, particularly when ship-to-ship combat is important, think hard about what faster-than-light travel technology you invent for this book, because the main requirement of a faster-than-light drive technology in science fiction is it advance the plot. You need to think really hard. That's the one world-building thing that you have to decide very, very early on to make your book as interesting as possible. Because if you build a world with, say you have a world with wormhole jump gates that are fixed in space, everybody knows you're going to come out of them. Well, that's going to be a whole different kind of combat. You have to go from that wormhole to whatever planet you want to go to, and you have to fight the whole way. To get through the wormhole, you might have to send like barrages of missiles and maybe dummy ships, and just to get all the defenses down so you can get your ships through. And then you're going to have to fight every kilometer between that wormhole and your target. If you have faster than light hyperspace style faster than light drive, like I said, you can hop in and out of hyperspace. You can go from one end of the system to the other in an eye blink. You can run away. which means battles can last a lot longer and yet still be exciting. If you get damaged but your drive still works, you can hop out to the edge of the system and repair it before you come back. So, and if it's a warp style drive like Star Trek, like that Alcubierre drive we were talking about, then they're still going to see you coming from a long way away, but they may or may not be able to strike at you while your warp drive's on. So maybe the real trick is going to be you can't surprise them because they see the ship coming. So they're going to be waiting at that planet or whatever target it is with all their defenses, and at some point you're going to have to turn the drive off and fight it out. So anyway, that's a key part of how you envision your space battles, how you describe them, is what kind of a drive you're using, what kind of shielding you have, what kind of weapons you have. What does combat look like in space in those situations? And describing it is best done through the eyes of an individual who is intimately involved in this combat, somebody who's got a job to do, like the one who's firing the weapons, the engineer who's having to fix the damage, something like that. You have to get the fight through their eyes and feel the tension they feel. The weight of the lives of everybody in the ship is in their hands. Okay, and getting down to action, more hand to hand, mano a mano. Describing fist fights and gunfights, you run into the same problems you do with space battles, is that they all start to run together. And again, my advice on this is don't dwell on, oh, he threw a roundhouse kick and the other guy stepped inside of it and threw a uppercut or what. You don't need to describe every single move. Now there may be a key part of the fight where the fight's about to end that you wanted to say he ducked the punch, stepped inside, and threw a cross that caught him in the jaw, and the impact on his knuckles stung almost as bad as the blow to the guy's head. But the key to any fight, whether it's a gunfight or a fist fight, is not describing each move they make or each shot they fire or punch they throw. The key is to describe what the person's feeling during this. If they get hit, the description you're going to make is not what kind of a punch the other guy threw, or if they get hit by a bullet, what kind of a bullet it was, where exactly it hit, all the damage it did. You have to describe what they're feeling. The punch impacted. Stars filled his vision, and a dull ache, reverberated through his cheek as the punch impacted. And for key seconds, he stumbled away, unable to think. Or, the impact of the bullet was like a red-hot poker through his gut. You have to describe what the person's feeling and thinking, because they're not going to be thinking if they're shot. They're not going to be thinking, it was a pistol caliber round. It didn't penetrate my body armor, but I knew that I had to get out of there because another round would make it through. And you're not thinking that, so you get shot. You're not thinking at all. Your vision's full of red. You're in adrenaline dumping fight or flight mode. So it's better to describe what the person's feeling and thinking in that situation. And if you do that in an effective way, it involves the reader more in that action than it does if you do it in kind of a movie script way where like he jumped from one thing to the other and then he throws a punch. You're not writing a movie script that's going to be translated into visual action. You're trying to involve somebody viscerally in this action, and the only way to do that is to get them inside the head of the person that's in the fight. Okay, I think that's enough for now. I may do more later on if you guys want it, but that is my advice when it comes to action, to how description of action and info dumping and exposition. And I will talk to you guys next time. If you want to get a hold of me, dutyhonorplanet487@gmail.com, or you can find me on Facebook at facebook.com/dutyhonorplanet. See you next time.